Ultima Online. To say that this virtual world changed the industry really is an understatement. I mean, it literally created one effectively. It's associated with the term the very industry is now founded largely upon, MMORPG. Ultima Online was the first virtual world to break MUD's 255 player limits and then some at 2,800 players, and thus achieve massive status. Developed by Origin Systems and published by Electronic Arts, Ultima Online launched on September 24th of 1997. UO, as it's called for short, would be the first virtual world to eclipse 100k players subscribing and do it in record time, even for a time which was unprecedented. But more than just being the first, and the biggest, Ultima Online utilized a long-standing successful Ultima RPG franchise created and spearheaded by Richard Garriott, and a powerful MUD experienced team and lead developer Ralph Koster, and more. Ultima Online is still alive, and its creators made sure, officially or not, it would remain such by allowing, and not discouraging, free shards or community shards, aka worlds that are powered by communities, often known as private servers to most other gamers and other communities. However, UO hasn't had its time in the sun for some time, and has passed from right holder to right holder at this point. And although it has had some new rumblings here and there, like the new Legacy server fitting of its name, a new shard changing the very core of UO with a new realized vision, and well, a never-ending popularity of free shards, but many might not know the full history of UO, how it came to be, and how it actually had 2 failed sequels that never came to fruition, and how EA potentially fumbled one of the greatest MMORPG teams ever. Ultima Online is a pioneer in the virtual world, and is arguably one of the most impactful and influential titles that we have seen yet. It's an absolute pleasure to cover this game as someone who discovered it later, yet still managed to fall in love all the same. In the Death of a Game series, we like to take a look at the largest contributing factors for a particular game or company's failure, or death, and document them through the use of a timeline filled with clues, so us, the detectives, can solve the case at the end, during the final deduction, every detective's moment of shine. However, the Death of a Game series has never been just about covering failures and massive shutdowns. It's also about covering pieces of virtual world history, lesser known or not. We've showcased this in episodes like PSO, Star Wars Galaxies, and even the Cox episode. City of Heroes, where the videos highlighted some of the beauty and success of the games, and the history of how they got there, less than how they necessarily failed. That being said, every virtual world can be improved, and many of these stories have such interesting happenings that can change the course of the development of the game for the worse. Ultima Online is no different, a game mired in controversy since the beginning. A game that the company funding it didn't really even believe in, and a game that led to the creation of an entire extra genre and influenced its own so heavily that you can't blink in a virtual world without seeing or hearing some influence from UO. This is Yoshi P's favorite game after all, and many more developers and players. This episode is special, not just because we want to document this great world-changing virtual world, but because we even got an exclusive interview with the lead designer himself, Ralph Koster, concerning the game.
Hi, I'm Ralph Koster, and I was the original lead designer for Ultima Online.
So without further ado, detectives, we have a massive story to tell about a massive world that made the word massive a part of all of our lexicon today. Let's talk about Ultima Online, the whole story. The story begins with a single-player game. Hey, that sounds familiar. Ultima is actually an ancient single-player RPG series from 1981 created by a Texas-based UK dual citizenship holder, Richard Garriott. Richard was none other than the son of Owen Garriott, one of the first NASA scientist astronauts. Richard was a major fan of Lord of the Rings and Dungeons & Dragons, and began writing computer games in his spare time in high school. Richard would actually go to the same college as me, University of Texas, and then began programming the first Ultima for the Apple II. Published by Sierra Online, Ultima 1 and the 2 subsequent Ultimas would reach success for the time, and lead to Richard and his brother, and their father, to establish their own company, Origin Systems. By 1985, with the launch of Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar, Richard would have gained notoriety, not notoriety, notoriety even greater, and success with his RPG series even further, even coining the term Avatar based on Hindu concepts of deities. Origin Systems would create a number of more Ultima games, ultimately up to 8 of them later on, before they would stumble into creating an online version. This is significant because it would mean that Ultima Online later on would have an already built and expanded world, and one that players were already familiar with, just like Phantasy Star Online had that with Phantasy Star in Japan. Electronic Arts, who was founded 10 years before by former Apple employee Trip Hawkins, who helped introduce much of the big business that we know today into the video game industry, had grown to become a successful developer and publisher. It was Trip who pushed EA into sports, franchise-by-year sequels, and much more. Anyway, let's talk about the evil NDA some other time. The reason we're talking about them in this case is that they were growing to the giant monster that we know them as today at this time. And at the time, they were acquiring tons of video game companies along the way, and leaving a wake of destruction as well. EA would acquire Origin Systems in September of 1992. I spoke to Richard Garriott a number of years ago, and Richard actually spoke to this acquisition and how fast things changed for him and his team at Origin. Richard would tell me, something to the effect of, that EA immediately made it be known that they were not a normal company, and the way that they were doing business might have been normal for the corporate world, but it wasn't for the budding video game industry. I've been told stories of Trip Hawkins himself, meeting with Richard, and the meeting going something along the lines of, well, that's not how things are done here, buddy boy, with Trip telling Richard that he wouldn't be able to delay his project from launch, which would actually be concerning Ultima Online, which we will now begin to talk about in detail. After the success of MMORPGs and MUDs of the mid and late 80s, Richard Garriott had the desire to build Ultima, his single-player RPG, into a world that would allow many players to share, even more players than any game ever before.
When we started working on Ultima Online, it was a big budget attempt to make that experience graphical. The folks at Origin had been talking about making an online game, Ultima, for quite some time. They talked about it with Sierra and other possible partners and so on. But it wasn't until really the internet came along and went graphical, post the Mosaic browser, that there was an explosion of interest in the industry for doing it.
Due to the architecture of Linux, which was used to power the early online MUDs, there was a file descriptor limit of 255. Because of this was a limit to the amount of players at the time. UO, on the other hand, was something revolutionary.
And I think it's important to set the context there. When we started out, MUDs in general capped at 250 concurrent. Meridian 59 capped at 250 concurrent. That was just basically a limitation of the day. Today, when we look at games that support more, it's often called server meshing. That's what Star Citizen's calling it now, but other people have other names for it. Ultima Online invented that technology in order to push up the capacity of a single server to about 2,800.
The UO team, which consisted of Richard Garriott and much of his Ultima series team, and only around 10 core UO developers, all of which had major MUD experience. Yep, nerds are to blame for the virtual world industry, and especially MMORPGs. Who would have thought it? Ralph Koster and his wife, Kristen Koster, would also be featured on this team, and although accredited for joining the team later on, would form much of the design background and foundation of the game. Rich Vogel would join the squad later on, as well as others such as Starlong, Scott Phillips, Rick Delaschmidt, and a ton of other developers who went on to form development teams for pretty successful games, and even games like World of Warcraft. The UO team would take many popular MUD systems and ideas and both simplify and combine them in some ways to put them together for their own game. The team would first prototype UO using an Ultima 6 engine, while the team would essentially pioneer the game the rest of the way in the process. The UO team had a budget of around $2.5 million, which was considered actually quite big for the time and the biggest budget of the time. And really the first big budget approach in a virtual world, I guess if you just don't consider Lucasfilm Games' Habitat, which was actually the first commercial virtual world. While they had an impressive budget and a talented nerd-hardened team, UO's development was anything but sunshine and roses in this success story you might have assumed. In fact, both UO and its first expansion were produced in intense crunch, as Ralph Koster would state in my interview with him concerning UO.
We built UO in about 2 years and a quarter. It was extreme crunch. There were issues with burnout, depression, drug addiction, you name it. People were just destroyed.
I've even heard words to describe this work environment such as unsafe, a sweatshop, and extremely stressful. Throughout these crazy work conditions that would eventually lead to the departing of all of the original team members, and UO was developed in record time, reportedly only taking around 2 years or less to develop. While EA had faith in Origin systems, there wasn't actually much faith in UO. Richard Garriott actually had to do a lot of convincing to even get them to greenlight the project in the first place. And according to Ralph Koster, EA didn't even expect the game to sell over a few dozen thousand copies. Meanwhile, leading into the game's beta, they would request $5 from players for potential beta testers to cover the shipping costs and cover the cost of an actual game disc, because that's how you had to do things back then, to actually beta test something. But it turns out that Ralph reported that 50,000 users were willing to do this, which would shatter EA's expectations and, well, just about everyone else's. Part of EA's handling of UO and their expectations of such, as Raph would admit to me, came from a massive lack of inexperience and knowledge. This would prove to be true for many more powerful publishers, including EA multiple more times, something that would arguably take them decades to learn. This is important to state because with UO and its success, goalposts were being shifted, erected, and moved all the time. It really was unprecedented at the time to see an online game of the scale that was soon to be unleashed upon the world in more ways than one. Though it should be added that some of the most complex systems, such as the ecology system, never actually made it to the launch. The UO team was in such a crunch that they had to cut out a lot of the content before launch, such as 2 entire playable continents and more. So even though UO would make a crazy impact, even Raph admitted to me that the team behind the game didn't really have an idea of that. Or better yet, their belief had been sort of burned out of them over time. That's what makes their success all the more impressive. The beta test for UO would take place September in 1997, just before the launch of the game, and would feature multiple tens of thousands of players over the course of the days that it was up. UO didn't have the luxury of going to trade shows, well, besides E3, which was a fledgling, mostly commercial-focused convention, RIP E3, so they had to do their marketing through the use of their existing IP, Ultima, and, well, word of mouth. And while this is more difficult, it creates actually a more cemented community and a support system surrounding the game. Word of mouth is the most effective marketing in virtual world history, because it's how humans can relate these experiences to other humans in a way that makes us want to join in on the world, in a way where they don't have a financial gain from it either like a developer would.
Ultima Online, from the very beginning, was meant to be something that drew lessons from all of them at once, and our core philosophy was to build and simulate an alternate reality that players could kind of live in.
Ultima Online launched on PC September 24th, 1997, and, well, the rest was really history. Literally. Not only was UO one of the first major virtual worlds to launch in the 90s, it was by far the largest in scale, player size, and popularity. For many MUD players, UO was an instant hit, because it was an expansion on many of the things that they already enjoyed and featured in their own games. And for RPG players yet to venture online, now they had 2D graphics to help them see things and a world of possibilities and roleplay opportunities ahead of them. UO, at the core, had a simple gameplay loop. You accrue wealth, power, in the form of a variety of skills, and you form relationships with other players, whether in the form of groups, friendships, or guilds. What you do now with that wealth or newfound power is really up to you, and thus that was where the complexity lied. If you want to be a tamer who would sell exotic animals without ever lifting a sword, you could, or a real estate broker, or perhaps a thief who would steal from players and monsters. What if you wanted to become a legendary beggar? All of that was possible in UO. How you achieve that wealth, that you then use to enrich your character, and in the world that you inhabit, such as things like player housing, is really up to you. And that's the beauty of UO. The thing people hate these days, that classic, you can do anything statement, which really kind of translates to just, you can't do much of anything, was actually true in Ultima Online, and true in the late 90s. Now think about that for a second. The reason that this is also a bit of a sad thing to say out loud is because it's not really the case in the current virtual world history today. Many of the virtual worlds, largely not the massive variant, don't really offer anything besides fighting and increasing your power level. This actually comes more so from Deku MUD and MUDs like that, which were only a particular slice of MUDs and were only focused on vertical power progression. This game formula would become so popular it would lead to the creation of EverQuest, WoW, and even RuneScape. Now, there's nothing wrong with a bit of variety, but after Deku MUD's formula was so popular, it's almost like players in the industry forgot about UO's approach and other MUD styles, an approach that was supposed to be for all kinds of players, from all walks of life. Even things like VR chat would have had a place amongst MUDs. Virtual worlds weren't just for those who wanted to compete for levels, whether in PvP or with PvE raids very common in this type of game. This would actually be proven when data would come out concerning UO's player base, which even in the late 90s and early 2000s had a record-breaking impressive 20 to 30% female player base. And an approach that was not only successful, it was revolutionary, and still a torchbearer today, with very few games being able to eclipse it in terms of sheer options and ingenuity.
What UO represented was kind of the dream of a more all-encompassing online game. And we see that influence later in things like Sword Art Online, Ready Player One, pretty much every depiction of immersive alternate worlds in media.
Raph spoke to this with the success of the survival genre, which took UO's most common gameplay features and aspects, unrestricted largely, PvP with full loot, territory control and player housing, and a focus on player progression and leveling. Something that you can even see in the forefathers of the survival genre, like Minecraft, created by Marcus Notch Persson, who's actually a former virtual world developer and lover, being behind Worm Online. Ironically, Minecraft is a game focused on proc-gen world building and PvE largely, and yet has the most popular PvP servers, and the PvP servers are the most popular for Minecraft. Speaking of PvP, that's something that we're gonna have to talk about a little bit later. Within a few months, UO would eclipse 100K paying users, becoming one of the most commercially successful games ever.
Originally, when we started out, we did not have any idea that UO could potentially become as big as it did.
The game cost $65 and was costing around $10 for a monthly subscription fee. And this was during a time where barely anybody had computers, where now UO would become a reason that you would actually get a computer. UO, besides being a good game, was creating stories that were memorable and would be remembered and documented for many years to come. That's where the magic of virtual worlds lied, in identity expression, socialization, and emerging gameplay, or experiences. That's because science says that experiences are more memorable than purchased goods, which means that theoretically, virtual worlds like UO were a never-ending supply of novel and emergent experiences, unlike anything of the time. This was an addiction for both players like me and the business heads behind it all, in this case, EA, which would explain why they would continue to pour upwards of like $1 billion into the industry after that in the next 15 years. EA had a knack for being early with things, and with UO and virtual worlds, that was no different. But EA being early isn't necessarily a good thing. UO would truck on with no stopping straight into their next expansions, still helmed by Raph Koster.
We started Second Age basically January of '98, and I was literally the only original UO team member left on the team. Everyone else either moved over to UO2, went back to U9, or quit the company. That was the degree of burnout, right? Like, we had programmers who were so angry about being on call with pagers.
The Second Age, also dubbed T2A, would launch October 29th, 1998. And this is the most positively received expansion in the game's history. This can be seen both in how many free shards utilized this patch date and the reception of the time. The expansion would also only cost $7 and add the Lost Lands continent to the game, as well as a big window mode, expanded chat features, and a tutorial. The new update also featured a cis-trans system, which basically allowed people from different cultures and different languages to speak to each other with a rudimentary system, something that PSO would actually use to great success later on. Delucia and Papua would make their appearances as major towns. While the reception was positive, especially from the player base, the critics were right to point out that perhaps it wouldn't be expansive enough to stop the upcoming 3D virtual worlds that were yet to launch. You have to think, UO came from the 90s and 2000s. During this time, we see the most technological shifts and advancement in gaming history, which were going to hurt UO in the sense that they were going to look very dated, pretty much within just a few years. I mean, the PlayStation came out in 2000. UO would continue to shatter the ceiling though, now with the ability to spread to Asia and even Europe. And although this might not really seem significant to mention, the reason that new markets were so important for UO being exposed to is that now these markets were experiencing virtual worlds for the first time, especially the Western kind, because Korea was also very early to the fray. Second, it would actually turn UO into one of the first actual global virtual worlds. And finally, it would plant the seeds that would lead to what would come later in the Japanese and Korean markets. For example, around this time, you have a young Yoshi P playing UO, dubbed one of his top 2 favorite virtual worlds. A very crucial event would happen around the same time. While Origin Systems reportedly had over around 200 developers in total, the majority of them were focused on Ultima as a franchise, meaning Ultima 9. However, Ultima 9 would fail to meet the hefty expectations that were placed on it after it launched, and due to such, EA would actually shift Origin systems to a multiplayer online studio only. While this might sound like a logical conclusion, and fair play, it was actually EA's handling of Ultima 9 that was the large reason it failed. For example, they had their team split and focused largely on UO, a team that didn't even want to work on the game, by the way, and they had to change the engine a few times while trying to transition to open world 3D, and they had to rewrite the story a few times. I mean, Richard Garriott literally showed up at the last second and kind of like saved the day with Ultima 9. Needless to say, EA had little idea, especially for the time, for some reason, that giving your video game developers little time or tools leads to bad outcomes. They literally took the majority of the Ultima 9 team off the game, moved them to another game, then Ultima Online's sequel in the background, which was another game that they didn't want to work on, and it wasn't wanted by the UO core team, who just wanted to keep expanding the original game.
The core original team, which was those mud folks and a few others, was relatively small, right? We're talking under 10 people were really what you'd call the core UO team. And then an army of people was brought over from Ultima 9. And many of them didn't want to be there. The combination of that was a lot of burnout. We built UO in about 2 years and a quarter.
I mean, the history of Ultima 9 has its own page dedicated to it. That should tell you something. EA forced Ultima 9 despite losing much of its original leadership and team, having to be redone essentially by Richard Garriott himself at the last second to launch by the end of 1999. So it wasn't a surprise Ultima 9 was a failure, and EA's handling of it and everything surrounding it, especially Ultima Online, would lead to so much souring amongst the developers of the franchise and IP, that nearly all of the original developers would start departing after this. Before the team would fully fracture, would come the news that EA was indeed working on a sequel for UO, dubbed UO 2. Ultima Online 2 is being billed as a second-generation MMORPG meant to improve upon the first game and push the genre even more forward. Most importantly, it would feature a 3D engine allowing it to compete with the 3D monsters to come. The design would also disable things like PvP except in special areas, emphasize more grouping, as large as even 20 to 30 player groups, and they would limit the ability for players to become all-around GMs. That's because in Ultima 1, there was already a skill cap of around 700 skills. But that was still enough to create some super powerful murdering nerds. But you can actually watch the trailer and pitch video for Ultima Online 2 on screen now, and throughout this segment. For starters, the animations are actually really good for the time, and there was something certainly UO about it, but it also kind of looked a little bit more generic, which is actually a very common problem that 2D games would have whenever they would try to shift to 3D. Best examples of this being Dark Eden, another one of my favorite virtual worlds. But perhaps with UO 2, with these ideas, could have been something great. Because the T was, according to Raf Koster and more, the majority of the OG UO devs didn't even want a sequel, realizing that it would split their ability to create more art and potentially kill a budding virtual world before it ever really started. But EA, regardless, would start developing throughout the next couple of years. This would mean none of the leaders like Richard Garriott and Raf Koster would be featured on the project, UO 2. This would also mean that Richard Garriott and Raf Koster themselves and the remaining UO core team would start departing. Raf and Richard would take two different immediate paths. Richard would actually take the majority of the Ultima team to found Destination Games a bit later on, where he would develop and launch Tabula Rasa, before becoming the head of NCSoft's Western Division. Raf instead would immediately join Varan Interactive, pre-Sony or SOE, and would develop Star Wars Galaxies, another world-defining virtual world that still sees a lot of play on private servers today. During this time, UO would see a whopping 150,000 subscribers. EA was raking in the dough, even though the creators had moved on. Sadly, I don't really think that the UO team ever really got the recognition that they deserved for creating such a successful work of art. UO wasn't without faults though. And no, not just the aging graphics and engine either, or the fact that the game was incredibly complex and difficult to pick up as a new gamer. No, a large issue breeding since the beginning of the history of Ultima Online was the PvP, more specifically, the lawless PvP that was taking place in the majority of the game. The reason this was such an issue was that because not all players were focused on combat, especially in Ultima Online, which allowed for that, or even just PvP focused, they would encounter other players who were, players like me, who specialized in fighting solo and trying to steal as much loot as possible, aka player killing. Now, player killing originally was supposed to be used by nerds like me as more of a badge of honor to describe the players killing other players against the odds and then taking their loot. But instead, player killing became a way to describe all forms of PvP, including griefing and ganking that was taking place rampantly in UO. Now, ganking is not against the rules, it's just killing somebody whenever they're not aware, but griefing, in many cases, is. Well, if there are rules. That's where things started to kind of blur lines, and made UO for a lot of players just not really fun, and impossible to even imagine it being fun, because they thought now I can die, lose my things without much recourse. To make matters worse, as Raf Koster admitted to me in our interview, Raf wanted a hands-off approach, and wanted the community to solve the problems more so. Issue being that the players didn't have enough tools to stop the griefers. Sure, things like guards came later and even anti-PK guilds could stop them, but these were pretty limited. Bounty systems didn't exist, alignment systems were barely there, and the criminal system was very easy to take advantage of. There were also very few ways for non-PvPers to deal with these players, which is more so the issue, not the fact that the PvP even existed. That's exactly what the infamous/famous expansion UO Renaissance set out to do. Initially bragging that they were going to double the world size, UO's team would actually just clone the previous world and allow for PvP in only one of those maps, and the other map you actually had to flag for it. One world dubbed Felucia, the other world dubbed Trammel. The problem was that one of these worlds effectively allowed players to remove all risk, which meant that they could increase their power levels in banks without really anything stopping them. And this is a problem for two reasons. One, they can effectively beat the game this way because hoarding is always effective in virtual worlds. Second, the game wasn't intended to be this way. So now players could get even more powerful and grind very easily in a way that necessarily wasn't supposed to be there previously. Now, logically, why would players not want to accept this deal? It's a pretty good deal. You can go to one zone and just PvE without ever having to worry about being PK'd. But here's the thing, opinion aside, the data actually proves that it was successful. According to Gordon Walton and Raf Koster, Trammel brought back tons of players in the dozens of thousands even. So it was a success, right? Case closed. Well, sort of. While it might have brought back initial players, there's no guarantee that those players wouldn't have quit for another hardcore reason. Especially with the more casual MMORPGs on the horizon. Worse, the most memorable aspects of UO, included in the reviews concerning the game, reflections, recollections, postmortems, and more, was about the PvP. Whether it was being ganked, griefed, ganking somebody, being a PK, or even like an anti-PKer. This means that, in my opinion, as even Raf admits, the better approach, which Raf even now seems to be more inclined to agree with too, in a modern context, would have been to properly fix the systems instead of just removing them outright. But this requires you to, as Raf postulates, to essentially become a governor/government, to make sure that you can rule the community properly, which is not laissez-faire. But Raf told me that he doesn't really see a way that the laissez approach really works anymore, not with the harm capable whenever it's present.
Partly thanks to just compute power and tools we have today. Second, we have, as operators of online social spaces, mostly abandoned worrying about how people treat one another, which leads to modern social media as a cesspit compared to what the internet used to be like.
Too long didn't read, or in this case listen? Well, basically, Trammel changed the core of the game so much that although it did lead to some short-term success, it also led to a massive schism that led to the further popularity of free shards. Again, this is both seen at the time just by looking at the shards as they got erected, and the fact that T2A is the most popular world state. Whether that's just because of the Trammel that comes after it is arguable, but it shows that perhaps had Ultima kept some of the servers originally to enact the same concept, there could have been a way to retain those players instead of losing them. That being said, I think it's unfair to call Renaissance a bad expansion, which sometimes players do. It was actually a response to a lot of player feedback and things worked out for a time. It's just more that in some ways it was unnecessary if more time and thus planning had been put into constructing those aspects of the world. Remember, the game was really rushed. Or if they had plans that were put into action to alleviate the problems much sooner. Well, of course, I think there could have just been a middle ground. Why? Well, because we've seen it in games like RuneScape and the entire survival genre, and when all else fails in a synthetic world, you can compare it to ours, to find similarities or inspiration. And well, is crime rampant to the point that society doesn't function, like UO was early on? Well, no of course. And for many of us listening, we can think of a dozen reasons why. PvP and the loss of items will never not be an addictive aspect of virtual worlds and online gaming, but the bad arguments and toxic people who defend it to exist without proper systems. But it won't work that way. That's a world where wolves are just feasting on every other kind of animal, aka gameplay style, and forcing them to quit the game. While many PvPers can wear it as a badge of honor to do this and call those players like Care Bears and stuff like that, there's no place for stuff like that anymore. When Minecraft is one of the most popular PvP games, you have to start to reevaluate things. Maybe just calling people Care Bears because they don't like bad systems is not a good way to bring them to join the PvP content. Many of these games that found success with these mechanics, such as Albion and RuneScape, had the benefit of evolving their systems over many years or just borrowing others. Ultima Online can't really be blamed for the PvP grief saga. Nobody really knew what players were capable of yet, especially without much precautions to stop them.
Some people say, why don't they just shrug it off? And I think the thing that they miss is some people are logging into the world and they say, I'm in a boxing arena. Punching's part of it. Exactly. And other people say, I'm in a park. Well, the same thing that is totally fine in a boxing arena is way out of bounds in a park.
Although the sub numbers would jump back up, the success of UO wasn't very long-lived. In fact, the sequel, quietly being worked on in the background, was canned publicly March 2001, with the desire for the team to focus again on UO 1, which is what they originally wanted to do anyway, except now most of the original team was gone. This was a crucial blow for UO as a franchise, and Origin Systems as a company, because it would lead to a whopping layoff of over 200 employees, with the remaining members departing to join Destination Games with Richard Garriott. EA's mishandling of UO started from the beginning, and it really shows how bad many corporations like them have affected the virtual world industry. The third Dawn expansion would hit March 27th, 2001, and it would bring with it a new 3D engine and client. And although that might seem like a positive thing, it would actually end up being quite hated. Not only did the player base still playing UO not really care for 3D yet, or at all, hence them playing UO in the first place. In many cases, the 3D models were really low quality and low poly, and in different style than UO's actual 2D sprites and art. It was kind of like PS1 graphics, and remember, the PS2 came out a year before. My issue with the client besides those issues was that the performance was quite poor, and it being a bit of a misunderstanding of expansions of virtual worlds. What I mean is that expansions for virtual worlds historically have never been about bringing in new players, but more so, retaining the old ones. I don't know how much of the old player base was even asking for such an update, and yet EA and Origin would somehow, and for some reason, attempt 2 more similar clients that many would abandon just for better custom clients anyway. Lord Blackthorn's Revenge expansion would drop February 2002, and despite a lukewarm reception being a mostly story-focused expansion, I actually thought that it was quite neat, because it featured the Spawn comic creator, Todd McFarlane, as a writer. After the departure of Richard Garriott, UO was without its helm, story-wise, and that void was felt. The Age of Shadows expansion, which is probably my favorite post-T2A expansion, would add the Paladin and Necromancer archetypes in the form of their additional skills. Anytime new skills were added, I was a fan, as this is how old-school RuneScape has managed to keep its old game still new. AOS also added the Malice landmass, which is where I and many others would put their player housing because the old world zones were very crowded. The expansion wasn't without controversy, however, with many of the fanbase rejecting the new, shiny weapons that would designate the properties that they had attached to them. I personally don't really understand this. I mean, D&D has this as a concept, and remember, Richard Garriott was a mega D&D fan, and even Lord of the Rings has shiny swords. But UO was fairly medieval fantasy and lacked such things, and thus the nerds were angry. It also should be mentioned that during this time, UO would peak at 250,000 subscribers, before dropping down to nearly half of that within 2 years. This was impressive, even in modern times, but EA had their eyes set on more competition to come, and that competition would start shattering even more barriers. Raphcoster's next world-defining virtual world would launch June 26, 2003, repeating though the past issues of UO and launching way too soon. Still, Star Wars Galaxies upon launch was able to reach an impressive 300,000 subscribers in just no time, and even sold over 1 million copies at box price. Star Wars Galaxies best of all was 3D, and had many of the same things that players loved in UO, like vendor merchants, player housing, a lot of build variety, and some major expansions like city governments, the graphics, a popular IP in Star Wars, and later space combat. But they were different games, with Raph electing to focus more on cooperative content and team-based PvP instead. But SWG would be one of the many new virtual worlds to come, that would not only chip away at UO's existing population, but further expand the game market and ceiling in a way never seen before. Following the cancellation of yet another UO sequel, this time labeled Ultima X Odyssey, EA would shutter Origin Systems altogether, the studio behind the UO franchise. You can see some of the trailer and gameplay footage here, and it's bizarre. Yet again, we have something serviceable looking, and even for the time, and yet abandoned outright. Now perhaps this was because, as many people might not be aware, that WoW might have launched later that year in 2004, but it was playable for many insiders before that point, so many developers knew that WoW was coming before it came. This very well could have been a reaction to that, but then again, why even attempt it in the first place if you're just gonna give up and take your ball home before you even try? That's why it's much more likely that EA was to blame, yet again, for both misunderstanding the genre and how to run a proper video game development team. I mean, check out the gameplay. Besides the horrible sounds, it doesn't actually look half bad. Ultima X was supposed to have action combat, much improved 3D graphics, a much more improved scale. I mean, just check out this fly around trailer for an example of that. So much more of what could have been for the Ultima series, including the online variants. Sadly, in the end, we never saw another Ultima Online game released, with the cancellation of Ultima X being the final death knell for future titles, it would seem. This is sad because it meant that UO would be phased out, no matter what, due to the passage of time and competition. And that also many players would never get the chance to see the beauty of the game in a more updated format, or even in the older format, just because it was so old. Take Lineage for example. In the East, it's just as old, just about, as UO. Yet it's still around and kicking, and makes a boatload of money. More than UO does. On top of this, the series of Lineage itself has had like 10 spin-off games and 2 sequels and like 2 stolen projects that became games. I guess I just wish that UO got something closer to that fate. But I guess they didn't have the benefit of NCSoft running things. Just before the launch of EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft as behemoths, and UO would launch the Samurai Empire expansion, featuring the samurai and the ninja archetypes. Now, fun fact, or not so fun fact, this expansion was led by a later canned Blizzard development for harassment. And, well, it wasn't a very liked expansion either. Mondane's Legacy would feature a current lead developer of Blizzard, Maria Hamilton. This expansion felt like more of UO transitioning into more classic fantasy, which was more popular for the time, with the introduction of the elf race. And while I'm not totally against the inclusion of it, it does seem a bit coincidental that it took nearly 10 years for it to come out, and it came out the year after 2 games came out with elves. Now, EA would do as EA did, and would acquire another company, this time another online gaming giant in Mythic Entertainment, behind hit Dark Ages of Camelot and later on, Warhammer Online. Mythic after the acquisition would essentially be put in charge of UO as well, which was a EA property. EA wouldn't learn much with Origin's failure, and they would also screw up Mythic as well, though at the very least they had put some people who genuinely cared about virtual worlds in charge of the now fading franchise in UO. The population had regressed back to around 100,000 subscribers, which was still impressive, but not impressive for what was being shown to be capable by competitors. The whole success poisoning your mind sort of thing, pocket watching. This likely was why EA and team kept trying to reach for more and more market share, and didn't just accept that they were a niche title, without that much shine in the sun, which is perfectly reasonable if you're not gonna put out a new game, right? UO would try again to fix his dated client and graphics with the introduction of the Kingdom Reborn client. This client instead would go 2.5D, but the problem being, yet again, that the core art aspects were rejected by the player base. And well, the client was pretty buggy and not responsive. The UO team promised that the client would only be fully implemented when it reached a majority player usage, but that wasn't true, and it was forced on the player base yet again. The good thing about these 2 clients was that every time they came out, new and improved community versions would come out. The problem being, yet again, every time the official servers of UO would mess things up, the free shards would just continue to grow, which were already massively popular. The Stygian Abyss expansion would hit September 11, 2008, and would introduce gargoyles to the game and their homeland. You could also now imbue gear, and, well, you guessed it, another new client. But this time the client was only hated at launch because it was buggy and because they delayed its implementation in the first place. The enhanced client is actually quite enjoyed, especially amongst free shards where it sees a lot more usage. It allows you to play the new and classic graphics if you choose, with a focus more so on 2D. It just took the game like 10 years and like 6 expansions and 2 failed clients to get one. High Seas was a booster pack released October 2010 alongside with it, was supposed to be a set of booster packs released, but High Seas would be both the first and last booster pack. I think that High Seas was a cool update, much like the one that came after it, but it just gets marred because it was kind of overpromised. Now Mythic would continue to run things up until they would also fold, another casualty of EA, when Broadsword Online would take over control February 2014. This would actually be a bit of good news, as UO had been kind of left to the wayside in an abandoned bin for the past couple of years. This way the game would actually get some new updates and have the official servers continue to live. While this would get more brownie points in other virtual worlds, UO really didn't have issues with preservation, because free shards were still being more popular than live servers. This is a large reason why UO fans were unaffected by the unfolding continuing drama of the series, on live, and well, EA. Had EA and crew known about the possibility of classic servers and the potential of them, they could have been ahead of the curve and retained some of those free shard players and made more money. I mean, just look at classic WoW and old school RuneScape. The final expansion for UO, at least as of 2025, was Time of Legends, and just when you thought that UO wouldn't or couldn't expand their world in a more unique way, they did. It just took them a bit longer than it took Star Wars Galaxies. The expansion would introduce not just new zones, new skills, and new monsters, kind of like all of them did, but more house customization abilities, and even the ability to customize by tile. This feature was a feature that Raph was quite positive of, and even mentioned that he had a desire for UO to have cities on the same scale of Star Wars Galaxies as well, though it never came to fruition. UO, after 21 years of life, would finally go free-to-play sometime following their announcement on April 4th, 2018. Broadsword would also claim to outlaw multi-boxing, which had become a necessity to compete in old-school games like UO. Multi-boxing is when you cloned your client and played on 2 or more characters at the same time. Problem is that they didn't really enforce it. Fun fact, UO was actually supposed to get a Punk Buster a long time ago, and it never did. Endless Journey, though, as it was being dubbed, the free-to-play version, or freemium service, was allowing you to play the majority of the game while having the chance to upgrade to veteran status for more features. But while this was impressive, yep, you guessed it, free shards were even more impressive detectives and offered far more than the live service, whether in terms of the player base, variety, or content. UO Outlands is a perfect example of this and would become a behemoth free shard when it would drop September 2018. UO Outlands featured a new massive custom map, brand new dungeons and points of interest, and improved gathering and crafting skills. There's much more, but I'm not being paid by nor asked by Outlands to advertise this. I just wanted to mention it because a lot of my friends play on that server and had great experiences. UO Outlands allows for aging UO players like myself and my friends the chance to play the same game, but with new tricks and new wrinkles to it, all the while continuing to expand the game in ways that Broadsword, a glorified maintenance mode developer, just couldn't and wouldn't. An example of this is how little Broadsword was actually updating the game from 2022 to 2023, past the maintenance mode updates. Things got so bad that people were wondering when the supposed new server was even supposed to come. But Broadsword was managing more than just one virtual world now, with Dark Ages of Camelot also under their belt, and had very little resources on top of that, and very little staff working on the game. Meanwhile, on free shards, which feels like half of this episode, in the next episode concerning free shards, another update would come out for the much loved and played Outlands server dubbed Wildlands. More land masses, more dungeons, and more places to live and fight, and much more such as the naval additions that came later on, and then some from live. UO Outlands really is the most expanded way to currently play UO, and features the most active community. It's really a testament to the community of UO and UO itself to elicit that level of fandom and loyalty. I mean, it's not like these guys are making bank doing this. They rely largely on donations. That's just pure nerddom, detectives. The strongest force that there is, I should add. UO just changed so many people's lives, and it's still doing that 28 years later and making people so inspired that they're still innovating on the game design. While Broadsword was slow to move, they would finally strike in a big way with the new Legacy server. The new Legacy server was a truly novel experience, though many players felt like it was poorly advertised because it seemed to advertise more of a classic experience, though it was more of a modern experience and realized version of UO that I will explain. First off, you start by choosing your path from 3 NPCs in a tavern, which feels lifeless and pretty unimaginative, I might add. You then choose a class, which means that the UO skills have been repurposed into actual classes or archetypes that you would choose from. And finally, you progress in the game by completing quests, kind of like a classic Deku Mud or WoW or EQ style game, which was nothing like old school UO. Now, I don't have issues with the server personally, besides with how much it was advertised to the classic players in a misleadingly way. But I think that it shows little faith in the UO team, or what's left of them, that they actually have in the core game ideas itself. I mean, technically speaking, New Legacy as a server isn't an MMORPG according to Raf Koster because it wipes and thus lacks permanence. And repurposed novel servers are cool, but it's already what the free shard server and community was doing. But I can't fault Broadsword for trying to do things and novel things, especially when they had such little resources. With such few resources, Broadsword seems unable to do anything more than community teams at this point. Ultima Online is still alive, officially, and on many of its free shard servers as well. But UO never did get those sequels it was supposed to get, and it's been relegated to a maintenance mode now on official servers. Because of that, I think that it's a good time to put it on the Death of Game series, which doesn't just document failures, but also pieces of virtual world history and art. And so, detectives, with that music playing, it means that we have come to an end in this episode, and the timeline has terminated. While this episode was less about the failure of Ultima Online, there are still things that the game could do to improve its lot in life, and things that happened outside of UO and its control that kept it from seeing more success, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? UO could have been the West's lineage, and unfortunately, we only ever got one virtual world out of it. And so, what were some of the clues that led to UO not being so successful as it could have been, and slowly fading away from popularity and the mainstream focus? It was the father of MMORPGs, which comes with its positives and its quirks. Fierce competition coming out pretty much just within years. Trammel and the catalyst of free shards. Electronic Arts was clueless in handling Ultima Online. The OG team just about fully departed and even made newer and shinier games, shifting into maintenance mode. Time doesn't wait for anybody, not even virtual worlds. Ultima Online is one of the West's crowning achievements. A mixture of ingenuity, talented leadership, and a surprisingly big budget, god-level crunch, and a lot of luck led to the massive genre-defining success of Ultima Online. UO pioneered its own industry it created and helped create other genres in the process. Now, this video is not to take away from its achievements, or its momentous impact in the industry, but it's more so to highlight both its impact and highlight how much more of an impact it could have had things been different. I was personally shocked to see that EA's meddling into virtual worlds, full of ignorance, goes as far back as the first coined MMORPG, but paints a bit of a darker picture ahead, detectives. I don't know if hoping that big AAA companies are going to save the day is nearly as realistic as it was, or really ever was supposed to be. Not without the proper talent and vision especially. And that's not to say that the indie industry can just magically fix things either, because, well, they're gonna have a funding issue. Instead, I think we're gonna see a lot more measured approaches with particular markets in mind, as we have already seen for a number of years. Very safe games, as people would describe. Well, up until the next UO comes, yet again, showing everyone, or reminding everyone what virtual worlds are capable of in terms of their scale and ingenuity. Now, until that time, detectives, or, well, until the next case, please. Because, well, let's be honest, there's a never-ending stream of cases, new and old, and, well, this is how Tom and I make a living. So please show your support in the comments below, or show support by joining the channel's memberships, or going to our Patreon page. Let me know what were some of your favorite experiences and most memorable experiences in Ultima Online below, and thanks for watching.